When the camera starts rolling, they are gods. But that radiance, every bit of it, is nothing more than a lie. The greatest and most brutal lie in the history of cinema. Behind the dazzling cloak is a pair of eyes nearly blind. Beneath the bursts of hearty laughter is a body decaying from disease. And right at the peak of blazing glory, there are those clenching their fingernails until they bleed, just to keep their bodies from collapsing. The greatest role of their lives was not on film, but in concealing the shattering of their bodies and souls before millions of watching eyes. They deceived the entire world, with blood and with their very lives. Welcome back to the channel. Today, join us as we uncover 15 of the most tragic secrets of disabilities and unbearable pain that screen legends once kept hidden. 1. Alec Guinness, the veiled secret in the desert of the Jedi Master. In 1977, the scorching heat of the Tunisian desert seemed to burn everything on the Star Wars set. Sand whipped through the air, clinging stubbornly to the folds of a heavy Jedi robe. Alec Guinness stood there, imposing and dignified as Obi-Wan Kenobi, gazing toward the distant horizon of the planet Tatooine. Audiences around the world would later watch that scene and see a wise guardian, a man who could perceive every corner of the galaxy. But the truth was far harsher. Throughout the long days of filming under the blazing sun, whenever Obi-Wan needed to deliver prophetic lines or speak to Luke Skywalker, Alec had to subtly tilt his head, adjusting the angle so that his remaining eye could capture his co-star's image. Director George Lucas, standing behind the camera, nodded in admiration. He fully believed that the slow tilt of the head, the piercing gaze, and the slightly off-centered posture were masterful acting techniques, that Alec was immersing himself deeply into the role of a contemplative Jedi Knight. No one realized he was calculating every angle just to hide the truth that he was nearly blind in one eye. The burden of keeping such a secret was heavier than anyone could measure. Once, during a break in filming, fatigue may have weakened the defenses of the seasoned actor. Alec leaned toward Mark Hamill and whispered in a low voice, "Don't worry, I can see the future. It's just that mine is a little darker." That bitter joke carried both pride and quiet sorrow. That very impairment stripped him of normal visual reflexes. In return, Alec Guinness forced himself to act with his ears and with a fierce survival instinct. He listened to the rhythm of his co-star's breathing, sensed subtle shifts in the air, and turned the blur in his vision into the mysterious, irreplicable aura of Obi-Wan Kenobi. A legend was born from that very darkness. But the world of cinema holds more than one giant who had to conceal physical suffering beneath the spotlight. 2. Richard Burton, paying in blood for a voice that echoed through the world. Anyone who has watched Cleopatra, 1963, can never forget the moment Mark Antony speaks. Richard Burton's voice was not merely sound, it was a living force. A rich, resonant baritone that surged like waves crashing against the cliffs of his native Wales. A voice capable of shaking the world and stirring the hearts of the most beautiful stars of the century. Yet behind that regal authority was a throat bleeding within and a larynx slowly burning away. As the melody lingered unfinished in the air, she suddenly stopped. Barbara clicked her tongue, sat upright abruptly, and ran her hands through her hair with visible frustration. "That's not right," she muttered to herself, eyes fixed on an invisible point ahead. "That E note was slightly off, and the emotion I put into that line still isn't deep enough. Give me a moment. I need to find the rhythm again." Sam lay there in silence, staring at the ceiling, He turned the destruction of his body into an act of artistic sacrifice, draining every drop of blood to preserve a legendary voice for cinema. 3. Laurence Olivier, a brutal war beneath the stage lights. In the late 1970s, all of America was nearly obsessed with Farrah Fawcett's smile and flowing hair. More than 12 million posters of her in a bright red swimsuit sold out, proudly hanging in the bedrooms of men across the country. She was one of Charlie's Angels, the ultimate symbol of beauty, glamour, and desire of that era. But what millions of men staring at those posters every night didn't know was this: the most radiant woman in America only felt safe. Amid all that pressure, Sam's quietness became one of the rare places where Farrah could pause and breathe. 6 secret months together were 6 months of constant escape. They changed cars frequently, slipped through empty alleys, and only met in places no one would expect a star like Farrah to appear. But that secrecy couldn't hide the cracks between them, especially when they were alone in a room. She wouldn't allow herself to sweat, wouldn't allow herself to scream or lose control. It didn't feel like making love. He paused, then continued. It felt like being allowed into a museum, standing there admiring a beautiful porcelain piece, but absolutely forbidden to touch it. That perfect shell shattered. They just want to tear off a piece of that poster and take it home. They love this hair, this smile. But no one in this world wants to hold the real me. Sam lay still, stroking her trembling shoulder, his throat tightening with sorrow. But he also understood that this painful confession was the end of their secret relationship. Farrah longed to be loved for who she truly was. He continued to deceive his colleagues, deceive the audience, and perhaps even deceive himself. Until 1988, when Olivier was quietly hospitalized, his doctor looked him in the eye and delivered a chilling warning. He would only be able to stand on stage for a few more months before his body completely gave out. But neither death nor disability could stop him. With an iron will forged in blood and tears, he returned, completing the final role of his life like an unshakable monument. The terror of a body betraying itself is a haunting pain, and it once pushed another great comedian to the very edge of madness. 4. Peter Sellers, a smile bought with 8 encounters with death. Those words weren't whispers of affection. They felt like commands, forcing him beyond his limits. If he lost pace, showed fatigue, or tried to slow down, Cher would immediately show her disappointment. She would click her tongue, frown, then take control and push the pace even harder, forcing the struggling man to keep up. The exhausted man chose to let go, stepping aside for those who could match the diva's relentless pace. Sitting on his windy porch, the old cowboy smiled bitterly. Cher was the most brilliant fire I've ever known, but it demanded too much fuel. And me? I was just a fool who had burned out, craving nothing more than a peaceful, undisturbed sleep. Yet if Cher exhausted him with her endless physical demands, then the next woman drained him in He survived. But the price of that survival was a psychological shadow that would haunt him for the rest of his life. This time, there were no loud parties or speeding midnight drives. Everything began in an old roadside motel room where the wallpaper was peeling and the air smelled damp and stale. On a shaky wooden table, a cheap bottle of wine was already half empty. Sitting across from Sam Elliott was Jessica Lange. She stared at him intensely, her deep eyes absorbed as she spoke about authentic acting and the artificial nature of Hollywood. In the early 1980s, Jessica was at the peak of her brilliance. She was a major star with acclaimed films like Tootsie and Frances, a woman driven by fierce artistic passion, sharp, unyielding, and unwilling to compromise. They had become entangled backstage after a performance, drawn to each other. Their dates always took place in suffocating dark corners, thick with cigarette smoke and heavy, breathless debates. Jessica was sharp, and her emotions were so intense that they left no room. To her, without emotional nakedness, all intimacy was meaningless. Being with her, Sam gradually felt forced to open up parts of himself he had kept hidden his entire life. There was no space for silence, no room to escape. Every moment together felt like being confronted with himself in a way he had never wanted. The exhaustion built up slowly, quiet but heavy, and eventually 5. Alistair Sim, the creator of nightmares from a crooked gift of fate. She wasn't afraid his rough hands would mess up her hair or ruin her smile. She didn't drain him with endless demands, nor did she force him to expose his wounds. Catherine simply lay there, resting her head on his steady arm, smiling. That quiet cowboy finally stepped out of the dazzling shadows of his past, at peace and complete beside the one woman of his life. It turns out that behind the blinding glamour of Hollywood, the greatest happiness lies in the simplest thing: to be understood and to be accepted as who you truly are. Among the 5 famous women who passed through Sam Elliott's life, whose story moved, unlike many actors who desperately tried to hide their imperfections, Alistair Sim chose a path of pride and boldness. He turned his deformity into his ultimate weapon on screen. Whenever he played sinister, eerie, or eccentric characters, he deliberately exaggerated his hunched posture, pushing it to the edge of something truly unsettling. Once, while filming a comedy, a director loudly demanded that he straighten his back to make the frame less gloomy. Alistair took no offense. He simply smiled faintly, a knowing half-smile, and replied, "If I stand straight, the audience won't be afraid of me anymore." Behind that remark lay an extraordinary act of endurance. Scrooge's slow, haunting movements were not just meant to frighten audiences. They were, in truth, Alistair's way of hiding the sharp, stabbing pain running down his spine whenever he moved. He crafted his own unique rhythm of performance so that not a single groan of pain would escape under the stage lights. With remarkable intelligence, he took the very body that fate had twisted and carved it into a monument. But while Alistair turned physical deformity into his signature, elsewhere in the theater stood a man struggling within a world where his disability was entirely invisible. 7. Donald Pleasance, Eyes of Ice, hiding a slaughterhouse of memories. People have always wondered what created the chilling gaze of Donald Pleasance. Whether he played the villain Blofeld in James Bond or Dr. Loomis in Halloween, his eyes carried a terrifying emptiness, a razor-sharp stare that seemed to pierce through the soul. That was not method acting. It was the residue of blood, cold, and death. Before becoming a film star, Donald had been a real prisoner of war, held in the infamous Nazi camp Stalag Luft I. He did not act out horror. He had lived through it. Every day he watched his fellow prisoners slowly die from hunger, cold, and violence. Those memories burned themselves into his retina, turning into severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, that haunted him for the rest of his life. Yet instead of running from his past, Donald chose to confront it. Once on the set of The Great Escape, while other actors excitedly embraced their roles as heroic escapees, Donald quietly sat alone in a dark corner of the set. Suddenly, a blaring alarm siren rang out, a staged sound effect prepared by the crew for realism. In that instant, the set collapsed into something else entirely. Donald's hands trembled violently, cold sweat drenched his forehead. His mind was dragged back to the freezing nights in Stalag Luft I, where that very sound meant someone was about to be executed. And yet, when the director called action, the man, trembling under the weight of trauma, stood up straight. He stepped into the light, his eyes turning cold and sharp, and delivered a flawless performance as a cunning prisoner. The world watched and admired his acting brilliance, never realizing they were witnessing the most authentic documentary of a shattered soul. Donald Pleasance himself. The scars of war never faded from Donald's mind. But sometimes, an equally painful tragedy hides behind the brightest smile in England. 8. Ian Carmichael, the perfect lie behind England's brightest smile. If there was ever a symbol of optimism, elegance, and joie de vivre in British cinema of the 1950s, it was Ian Carmichael. The moment his name is mentioned, audiences instantly recall the image of a refined young man gliding effortlessly as if floating above the ground, always wearing a radiant, sunlit smile before the camera. He was the soul of comedy films, the man who brought joy into millions of households after the war. But behind that dazzling glow and those bursts of laughter, every single step Ian took on set was, in truth, a brutal act of physical torture. Ian suffered from severe chronic arthritis. The cartilage in his knees and hips had been almost completely worn away. Every step he took caused bone to grind against bone, sending sharp, searing pain shooting straight to his brain, as if thousands of rusted needles were stabbing into his flesh. For a comedic actor who had to run, move, and energize every scene, this was nothing short of a cruel sentence. To maintain the image of the cheerful young man, Ian constructed an intricate web of deception. Before each take, he secretly practiced walking at a slightly slower rhythm, subtly adjusting his center of gravity to reduce pressure on his joints, while still appearing natural. He cleverly negotiated with the crew to ensure that chairs, or hidden supports, were always placed just at the edge of the frame. The moment the director called cut, the lively man on screen would immediately collapse onto the nearest seat, gasping in unbearable pain. Once, after exhausting himself backstage, a fellow actor asked how he managed to maintain such boundless positive energy. Ian wiped the sweat from his brow, gave a bitter smile, and replied, "I smile this much so I can forget that my legs are screaming." His signature smile was not a symbol of joy. It was the only painkiller he had left to deceive the audience, and to deceive the body that was slowly betraying him. 9. Michael Redgrave, the misjudged drunk, and the tragic symphony of a rigid disease. In a sterile examination room heavy with the smell of antiseptic, a doctor frowned at the violently trembling hands of Sir Michael Redgrave. With a tone laced with judgment and a hint of pity, the physician advised him to quit drinking before it was too late. The prejudice of that era was overwhelming, making it easy for people to blame any loss of physical control in artists on alcohol. But Michael was not drunk. He sat there, swallowing his pride as an English gentleman, carrying a far crueler sentence than any drink. Those trembling hands were early warning signs of Parkinson's disease, silently destroying his nervous system. For an actor, losing control of the body is like a violinist having their instrument snapped in half. On the grand stages, the hands that once rose with pride to interpret Shakespeare's works had now become traitors. Yet, instead of surrendering and retreating behind the curtain, Michael Redgrave chose to completely reconstruct his philosophy of acting. If his hands could no longer move with precision, he would strip away every unnecessary gesture. He poured all his strength, conflict, and fury into his blazing eyes and his deep, resonant voice. Elaborate physical movements were replaced by the sheer weight of stillness. There were nights of excruciating performances when violent tremors struck in the middle of a climactic monologue. In those moments, hanging by a thread, Michael would immediately hide his hands behind his back, clenching his fingers so tightly that his nails dug into his palms, drawing blood. The audience never suspected a thing. They saw his chest rising and falling, his stillness brimming with restrained power, and they applauded, believing they were witnessing the pinnacle of controlled, internalized acting. No one knew that his commanding posture was, in fact, a cage, one in which he was wrestling desperately with a body slipping out of his control. Parkinson's could steal movement, but it could not take away his voice. Yet elsewhere, another legend would personally destroy the very weapon that defined his entire career. 10. Jack Hawkins, the mighty general in an empire of silence. In 1966, the harsh fluorescent lights of a post-surgery recovery room burned into Jack Hawkins's weary eyes. As the anesthesia faded, so did the fog, bringing with it a brutal realization. By instinct, the renowned actor, famous for his commanding military roles, opened his mouth to call his wife's name. But nothing came out. Only a hollow hiss escaped through the breathing tube in his throat. Laryngeal cancer had won. The brutal surgery had permanently removed and taken away forever the rich, authoritative voice that had defined his legendary career as an icon of British cinema. For anyone, losing their voice permanently would be a death sentence for acting. People assumed Jack would retire and fade into the shadows of sympathy. But they underestimated the will of a warrior. He refused to be erased from the silver screen. He continued taking on major roles, adopting a unique method. He would perform entirely through physical expression on camera, while another actor's voice would later be dubbed over his lip movements in post-production. Accepting that someone else would speak for him required an immense sacrifice of artistic ego. On set, Jack Hawkins carried an almost supernatural presence. He channeled all his energy into his piercing eyes, decisive gestures, and commanding nods. Audiences watching his later films often forgot that the voice they heard was not his, because when they looked into those blazing eyes, they felt everything. The suffocating pain of being robbed of speech, and the unbreakable strength of a soul that refused to yield. He proved that sometimes silence is the loudest scream of all. And sometimes the most terrifying screams do not come from the throat, but from the very distortion of flesh itself. 11. Charles Laughton, the mirror of physical horror in Quasimodo. When Charles Laughton accepted the role of Quasimodo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Hollywood makeup artists began preparing thick layers of rubber and grotesque prosthetics to transform him into a monster. But they soon discovered something unsettling. Laughton did not need much makeup to appear distorted. He was not acting deformation, he was truly feeling it destroy him from within every cell of his body. For years, Charles had suffered from chronic stomach and intestinal pain, violent internal spasms that left his body rigid and drenched in sweat. Worse than the physical agony was his body dysmorphic disorder. He despised his own overweight, awkward frame in a Hollywood world obsessed with perfection. He carried shame, loneliness, and rejection, just like Quasimodo in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. When the camera rolled, he did something profoundly cruel to himself. He tore down every psychological barrier, allowing the real pain in his gut to tear through him, letting his insecurity seep into every grimace. The twisted, anguished, simultaneously savage and pitiful expression of Quasimodo on screen was not a masterful acting technique. It was Charles Laughton's real face under physical torment. His limping steps, his recoiling body under the crowd's stones, those were genuine physical reactions of a body screaming in pain. By sacrificing his own flawed body, Charles turned his chronic suffering into an emotional earthquake, creating the most haunting and tragic Quasimodo in cinematic history. 12. John Gielgud, a stage god living inside a trembling soul. The suffocating darkness behind the stage curtains, thick with the smell of fabric dust and sweat, seemed ready to swallow John Gielgud whole. In less than 5 minutes, the crimson velvet curtain would rise, and thousands of discerning London eyes would fix upon him. They were waiting for a god, a monument of Shakespearean acting, embodying unmistakable British aristocratic grace. But that great man was huddled in a dark corner, teeth chattering, his entire body trembling like a leaf in a storm. His heart pounded violently in his chest, threatening to tear through his elegant costume. This was the moment when a full-blown panic attack sank its sharp fangs into his mind. Stage fright and clinical anxiety were invisible monsters that John had to nurture and battle every single day. He craved the spotlight, yet feared judgment. His terror of failure was so extreme that it turned him into a tyrant toward himself during rehearsals. To control the chaos within, he drove himself into obsessive practice, repeating a single line hundreds of times until his throat bled and his voice ran dry. He believed that only mechanical perfection could serve as a lifeline against the collapse of his nervous system. There were nights when his hands were ice cold and drenched in sweat, when his knees felt incapable of holding him upright. A director beside him would gently place a hand on his shoulder in reassurance. But Gielgud's true miracle lay in the turning point. The moment the creaking sound of the stage pulleys lifting the curtain echoed through the theater, something cruel and magical happened. John took a deep breath. He stood tall, shedding the broken shell he had been behind the curtain, and stepped into the light with a flawless, defiant smile. His voice rang out with authority, his movements calm and regal. The audience watched in awe, witnessing a master. Not a single one of them knew that their god stood only a breath away from collapse and madness. Psychological torment can break an artist, but a death sentence of the body, accompanied by the prejudice of an entire era, is a tragedy of a completely different kind. 13. Denholm Elliott, the whisper hidden beneath the smile of an era. In the 1980s, global cinema came to know Denholm Elliott as a man with a warm, radiant smile, gentle, kind, and sometimes charmingly awkward. He was the indispensable companion of Indiana Jones, a face that brought warmth and laughter into millions of homes through countless blockbuster films. The kindness in his eyes and his composed demeanor shaped him into the perfect supporting character, the one who softened tension and grounded the story. Audiences loved him unconditionally. But beyond the camera, Denholm was carrying a cross far too heavy to bear. His body was being slowly consumed by HIV, a disease that not only brought death, but also a social death sentence in the climate of the 1980s. It was a dark era where fear and stigma spread everywhere, and the media stood ready to tear apart the image of anyone associated with this forbidden illness. Faced with such a brutal reality, Denholm chose a path of complete solitude, absolute silence. He shut every door into his private life, cloaking himself in calm composure to protect the image he had spent a lifetime building. Even as his immune system weakened, as fevers tormented him through the night and exhaustion drained every ounce of strength, he continued to appear regularly on set. When makeup artists had to apply extra layers to hide his pale, gaunt skin, some could not hide their concern. In those moments, Denholm would gently take the hands of a few trusted friends, offer a strained smile, and whisper a heartbreaking lie. "I'm fine. Don't worry. I've just been a bit tired lately." He used his own acting talent to perform the most flawless role of his life. Even in his final moments, Denholm Elliott held on to that secret, choosing to endure the slow, consuming pain alone rather than allow his radiant image to shatter in the eyes of his fans. If Denholm used silence to conceal his decline, then another man chose to transform the destruction of illness into an entirely new language. 14. Kenneth More, a tragic transformation rising from the ashes of a rigid disease. Throughout the 1950s, Kenneth More embodied the image of the resilient British hero. He was known for playing courageous officers and legendary pilots with a strong physique, decisive gestures, and an unbreakable spirit. That man-of-action persona became deeply ingrained in the public consciousness, a guarantee of box office success. Audiences expected to see Kenneth More charging through gunfire, soaring across the skies, or leading with unwavering strength. But at the height of his brilliance, an unwelcome visitor knocked on his life: Parkinson's disease. What began as subtle symptoms quickly turned merciless. His hands started to tremble uncontrollably, his joints stiffened, his reflexes slowed. Holding a glass of water without spilling became a challenge, let alone throwing punches or performing stunts. Faced with the reality that his body was stripping away his very lifeblood, many actors would have chosen to retire with dignity. But Kenneth More refused to surrender. Instead of clinging to fading glory or relying on stunt doubles to maintain the illusion, he made a bold decision to dismantle his heroic image and rebuild himself from the ground up. He actively turned down action roles, quietly shifting toward psychologically rich characters, older figures filled with reflection and inner wounds. Most remarkable of all, Kenneth did not hide his illness. He turned it into a prop. In scenes demanding emotional depth, he used the involuntary tremor of his hands to portray fragility, vulnerability, and profound philosophical conflict. The rigidity of his body was reshaped into a quiet, contemplative beauty. Parkinson's destroyed the tough hero, but it gave birth to a deeply introspective philosopher of acting, moving audiences to tears with a truth that transcended technique. One can turn decay into art, but sometimes a smile is used to bury the rot within. 15. Trevor Howard. Thunderous laughter masking a body in ruin. Trevor Howard always appeared on screen as the embodiment of a commanding British officer, a dignified man with sharp eyes and a perfectly pressed uniform. He was the symbol of masculinity, discipline, and strength. When the camera rolled, Trevor stood tall like an unyielding pillar, his footsteps echoing with authority. Those who worked with him admired the military presence that seemed ingrained in his very being. But behind the lights of the set lay a tragedy of self-destruction. Beneath that commanding exterior was a body decaying from within. Trevor Howard was a severe alcoholic, and his addiction had silently destroyed his liver beyond repair. Crippling abdominal pain and overwhelming exhaustion often brought him to his knees in the dressing room. Yet, the pride of an English gentleman would not allow him to collapse before others, nor reveal weakness on screen. To maintain that flawless facade, Trevor devised a brutal survival routine. Before each take, he secretly consumed large doses of vitamins, stimulants, and supplements to force his deteriorating body to function at its peak. When he stepped out among his colleagues, he deliberately unleashed booming, exuberant laughter. He slapped co-stars on the back, told jokes with explosive energy. No one realized that his loud laughter was merely a perfect disguise, a desperate attempt to cover labored breathing and suppress the nausea rising in his throat. Trevor performed the role of strength so convincingly that only when death finally came did the world realize what their idol had truly endured behind that artificial smile. 15 names, 15 legends, 15 pains buried flawlessly beneath the makeup of dazzling lights. They deceived the entire world, using the very fracture of their bodies and souls to weave the greatest works of art. The spotlight may fade, but the legacy forged through that proud sacrifice will live on forever. If these tragic truths behind the silver screen have moved you, don't hesitate to leave a like and hit subscribe right now. Turn on notifications so we can continue uncovering the untold mysteries of the cinematic world together in future videos. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.